So if you haven't already, make sure that you go to the daily participation and click on resubmit, and then a text box will appear where you can type in the three most significant things. And today we'll talk about public policy. And public policy basically is legislation either establishing a program or regulation. And we, of course, within the context of this class, for the most part, we learn about it through the how a bill becomes a law. It gets introduced in the House or the Senate, and then they have to send it to committee and research and investigate, and then it gets into the floor and can be amended or changed, and then both houses have to pass an identical version of that bill, and it has to be signed by the president. Pretty simple. But it actually is a lot more complicated than that because obviously they bring forward all these people, experts in the field, to answer questions about a bill. And it's actually those types of experts that give people like members of Congress the ideas for legislation in the first place. So first what happens is, why do we create legislation? Well, the public has an interest or concern. So something they feel that is needed to address an issue, maybe something they don't have in their community, or maybe something that is causing harm. And so either there is a market failure, so no business in the marketplace is able to provide something like a public park, for instance, or maybe there is a negative side effect or negative externality, is what we call it sometimes. So pollution, harm to workers, destruction of a local community. Those are all types of negative externalities or side effects that someone might experience because of business activity or maybe a natural disaster or something like that. So there's some kind of public interest or concern over these types of issues. And these people will bring forward their concerns to maybe even as low as a borough or city council, but maybe also their state legislature or Congress. And these legislators are going to work with members of the executive branch because if there's already a government agency like the Environmental Protection Agency, you're not going to start from scratch. You're going to go to them and say, hey, we've heard about this new type of pollution because of this type of factory that's in Omaha, Nebraska, and the Nebraska congressman, there's four of them, and the two senators are all concerned about this, and so are their citizens, the constituents or voters there. And so you come up with some kind of viable, workable solutions. So you have to research it, you have to send people there, you have to study and gather data, and you come up with a regulation maybe that can restrict that type of pollution. Or if there's some kind of a need for something, like there's no park in a town at all, people have to travel to way to the outskirts of a town in order to enjoy the environment. And so maybe they instead at the local level say, hey, we need a park built so they can condemn these buildings that no one's using anymore, but that will cost money, of course. And they can establish a park, but that takes planning and possibly getting grants. So maybe they'll write to their state legislator and say, hey, are there any grants available for this? And so that can often involve three different levels of government in some cases. And not only that, but obviously it's almost like starting a business, because when you start a business, you have to have a lengthy plan maybe, and in order to go to a bank and get a loan. And the same is true if you want grant money or tax dollars. You have to have a thorough, complex plan that's well researched and presented in order to start some type of new program or service. And so you find solutions that are viable. If it's something that can be solved by the private sector, if a business can take care of it instead, like if you go to that business, that factory, and say, hey, you're causing this pollution, they say, whoa, that's our fault, so we'll go ahead and take care of that. We'll change our production procedures and so on. If you really can trust them to do that, and it seems like they're doing it, then the private companies solved it, so there's no need for the government to come involved. But otherwise, if that isn't the case, then the public sector, the government, needs to get involved and take care of that situation and come up with those possible solutions. So then, of course, they have to actually present this to one or maybe even as many as three different levels of government. Perhaps they do get the city council to approve this new park, but the grant money for it comes from both the state and federal government. So the grant has to be approved as part of the state budget, and the grant has to be approved as part of the federal budget. So maybe all three levels at some point in time will have to get involved and look at the plans. And this park proposal might be included in paperwork that gets presented before a committee at all three of those levels and researched and questioned. And it's unlike, for instance, for something like this that they're going to call the Parks and Recreation Director from Titusville to go to Washington, D.C. and answer questions about the park, because they obviously get thousands of these applications. But you never know, and someone at the Department of Interior at the federal level might have to answer questions about it. So email correspondence they've had and things like that will all be taken into account. And then it has to actually be approved by the legislative body and then signed off by the executive. In Titusville, the case is just city council because the mayor isn't separate. But at the state level and federal level, it would be the governor or president that would also sign off on any type of major plans if it's bigger than that. In some cases, if the money's already allotted, like there's already a pool of money out there that Congress already approved and said the Department of Interior can use this for parks, and that's up to its discretion, then you don't have to have Congress approve. You might just have to have the city council approve instead. And of course, they would be fools not to try to get grant money. Lots of towns do that. So they want to use grant money instead of tax dollars because you don't have to pay grant money back. And then once it's implemented, you have to make sure you have competent people. And this is one of the problems and why it's necessary to have good civil servants instead of using the old spoil system. You have to have people that are experts, people that know what they're doing. A lot of places they'll hire at the local level. They don't have obviously big complex civil service systems, so they'll hire, this somebody's brother, or well, this person was in the military and they're a veteran, so we should hire them. Which sounds nice, but do they have any experience with parks? And if that's not the case, things could go awry, and problems can happen. And so you want to have good people at the local level that can take care of this kind of stuff and actually implement it. And then once it happens, any regulation or program, this is one of the problems. You can't just implement it and then forget about it. You have to come back to it years later, or maybe even 6 months later, and see, is this park working properly? Or is this pollution law actually addressing the pollution that was taking place? And so if you want to have good government, you also have to reform things every once in a while. And this is one of the things President Trump is definitely right about. He talks about trade as the one thing throughout his life, even when he was a Democrat in the past, he's been consistent about. He thinks deals should be renegotiated every once in a while. And that's true because NAFTA was passed in the mid-90s. It was actually negotiated before Bill Clinton in like 1991, 1992. And so 20, 30 years later, it doesn't make sense that we have the exact same trade deal. So things like that should be revisited every once in a while. So don't forget to type in your 3 significant things for this presentation.